The Last of Us Part 2 is about moving on from what we had before. On one level, it's about grief, how we cope with the pain of losing someone. On another level, it's about what we choose to keep and what we choose to leave behind. I would probably call this game a masterpiece. It's not without problems, nothing ever is. But this game is actually something really special.
But you wouldn't fucking know it looking at Twitter, would you? NBs, ladies, gentlemen, welcome to my Last of Us 2 review. I'm Jack Saint. Now, I am going to get to my analysis. I am going to talk about what's good about this game, but first, unfortunately, this one is going to be largely about the discourse. Sometime before the game was released, a fairly comprehensive summary of the plot was leaked online. The most shocking detail of the plot leaks, arguably the most shocking detail of the game itself, is that the protagonist of the first game, Joel, is murdered really early on in the game by a new character, Abby, who you later play as. Fans of the first game were incredibly pissed. Now, I have some sympathy for the distress it caused people. I'm a big Joel fan. A big fan of Big Joel. However, this devolved into a toxic, messy, in some cases actively harmful discourse around the game, claiming all sorts of gibberish rumors about the plot, the development, the intentions of the creators, which has somehow managed to last beyond the release of the game, with Laura Bailey, the actor who plays Abby, receiving death threats. This discourse is incredibly messy, so I'm going to group it by topic. This is too much, isn't it? I feel like this is way too much. You know what, just cut the whole thing.
So according to popular discourse in the days and weeks directly leading up to the game's release, Joel is graphically murdered early in the game by a character called Abby, who is a transgender woman who hates Joel for killing her father in the events of the first game. Clearly, posits the discourse, this is a direct attempt by the creators to spit in the eyes of the most dedicated fans of The Last of Us Part 1 by cramming in forced diversity and murdering the player avatar character, Joel. Who wrote this? Anita Sarkeesian? The tiny goblin men who run my brain won't allow me to have original thoughts, so I can only assume it was literally Anita Sarkeesian. What are Naughty Dog thinking? Neil Druck Man? More like Neil Cuck? Trans... There was a lot of anger, there was a lot of feeling of betrayal, but let's be crystal clear here. There was a fucking lot of blatant transphobia. As you might expect from specifically 4chan and generally angry gamers online, there was a lot of ridicule of anything about the game that was slightly outside of the norm. Abby being muscular, Ellie not looking like a supermodel, a whole bunch of really specific focus on Dina having a big nose. In some of these cases, this happens to coincide with other bigotry. Some of the people edgily memeing about Dina's nose were anti-Semitic, and they were trying to signal to other anti-Semites that they're one of the cool kids, doing the cool anti-Semitism. But in general, these attacks were just generic policing of how women's bodies should look. We should try and be understanding of what these guys are going through. When you've never seen a woman in your whole entire life, reality can be shocking. They don't look anything like Asuka Soryu. Their bodies have a whole 3 dimensions. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And yeah, some of them have penises. And some women have the physical power to pick you up and crush you like a grape. I'm not asking you to accept that, because that's just the truth. I'm asking you to admit it's kind of hot. Probably the biggest issue with all the transphobia directed towards Abby, though, was that she isn't actually trans. There's nothing in the game that indicates that she's trans.
So, oops.
I think it's pretty clear to see how we arrived here. Plot leaks indicated that one of the characters was going to be trans, Lev, the boy that Abby takes care of, who's a runaway from a religious cult. And these very smart and intellectual gamers rubbed their powerful brain cells together and decided the trans character must be the muscular woman you can see in the trailers. I think this is a pretty interesting example of how transphobia is just an extreme form of gender policing, and how that gender policing affects everyone, cis or trans. Like, would Abby be allowed in a women's bathroom?
Willie, you gonna stop her? She's fucking huge!
There was actually some discourse around the trans representation in the game from trans people too.
The actual trans representation, to be clear, from the actual trans character, who's actually trans.
Lev, who ran away from his community in a religious cult, is a trans boy. The group he comes from, the Seraphites, are worshippers of someone called the Prophet, who led a revolutionary action against the powers that be in Seattle, and the story of her life has become folklore and even religious scripture. The Seraphites are extremely culturally conservative, and when Lev shaved his head to look like the men in the Seraphites, they all freaked out and he and his sister had to run away.
I like Lev a lot. I think he's a well-written and fun character, and on a personal level, I have a lot of sympathy for a character who isn't accepted because he's bald.
The trans discourse around this character has been pretty interesting, I think.
And now an urgent message from our sponsors. We don't have any. If you want to support the channel, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/CurioVids, and if you give me $2, or more than $2, you can get access to my videos early, plus some bonus content, which I personally think is very good.
Some trans people feel that showing Lev get misgendered and deadnamed by people who are searching for him is a uniquely trans pain, and that the cis writers making the game were appropriating trans suffering by using it. More generally in media, this is an issue of trans characters always being abused in some way in every story they're in, and never getting to simply be. Now, personally, I think it's pretty appropriate to show this stuff here. These characters are textually transphobes and bad guys, and you murder them shortly afterwards with your gun or maybe a big knife. It's up to you. I think it makes sense for these characters to be engaging in this behavior, even if it's something we're sick of seeing all the time.
But can I just take a minute to appreciate what a more interesting discourse this is than, haha, muscles, Abby, trans, bad.
You could also criticize the game for having a slightly Orientalist attitude. Why is it the majority East Asian group who has this enforced primitive culture, this rigid conservative society, and these alien cultural practices?
But then again, maybe they didn't want to go in too hard on white conservatives. They already have a gang of gun nut slavers in Santa Barbara whose insignia is a rattlesnake and who call themselves the Rattlers. It's not too subtle.
Returning to Lev though, through the whisper telephone of Twitter, there was a rumor going around that he suffered extreme targeted transphobic violence in the game. Some people were calling it torture porn, and the narrative seemed to be a conflation of the bad time that Lev has in the late game when he and Abby are captured by the Rattlers, physical abuse, starvation, imprisonment, with the discourse to do with the appropriation of trans suffering.
I was actually pleasantly surprised to get to the end of the game and find out that Lev doesn't get, like, horribly murdered by bigots or something. I was really kind of expecting him to. I think it's worthwhile warning people against content they may find deeply upsetting or triggering, and for many people, misgendering and deadnaming will be enough because there's a lot of associated trauma. But a huge amount of the response I've seen from transmasc friends and transmasculine people online who've played the game has been really positive.
A lot of people have actually felt really affirmed by seeing a trans man, especially a trans man of color, represented in a AAA blockbuster game and played by an Asian trans man. There's like no representation of trans men in media. There's Buck Vu in the OA, and he's played by the same guy.
I want media creators to confront this pattern of always making trans characters suffer and everything. I want people who might be seriously hurt by seeing that suffering to be appropriately warned so they can choose to avoid it. I also want people to not miss out on stories that they might find genuinely positive and uplifting because people are misrepresenting them. I think we should have a discussion about how social media is affecting our discourse and the way we approach art. But first... So with the notion Abby was trans debunked, the anti-Abby gang needed a new focus, and something in the discourse drove a deep-seated need to prove that Abby overpowering Joel didn't make sense. It's unrealistic, they did it for no reason, it's just for shock value. Aha! Here's the take that stuck. No woman could realistically be as muscular as Abby.
This one really took hold for a little bit. If Abby isn't trans, read secretly a man, there's no explanation for her enormous muscles, right? No woman could ever look like that. Have Naughty Dog even seen a woman? Neil Druckmann, more like Neil Drunkman. This is an easy enough one to sort out, right? Abby's body is based on Colleen Foch, an athlete and bodybuilder who, if anything, is even beefier in real life than Abby is in the game. Besides that, there are loads of female bodybuilders in real life, much more buff than Abby. You can just Google female bodybuilding. for research purposes.
But hold up, if we're talking about realism, right? You can't really expect that real women could look like Abby in, like, the post-apocalypse. Like, we can't... Like, no one would have the diet and exercise to look that buff in the post-apocalypse. Like, Abby would have to literally live in the gym to look like that, which she literally does. She does literally live in the gym for 3 years to prepare for her revenge quest against Joel.
It's probably fair to say that seeing her dad die of being shot in the face has not had the best psychological effect on her, and she's gotten a little, obsessive. When you start the section of the game where you play as Abby, the first thing you see is that she was asleep in the room next door to a huge gym. Her people, the Washington Liberation Front, have occupied a sports stadium and have a whole town going in there, with farming and jobs and, yes, lots of exercise equipment. More than anything though, I find this particular facet of the discourse a little bit telling.
I think at its root, this facet of the discourse just shows us that people were just mad that they couldn't play as a man anymore and had to play as women, but they knew they couldn't say that because that's pathetic. So they had to find a different narrative. They had to find another way to find someone to blame. It's Star Trek. It's a Star Trek search for Spock? No?
Maybe the same source as you fight homophobic Christians? Or that Anita worked on the game? Or that Abby is trans? Or that I was scanned and mocapped anything in the game? Or that we paid for reviews? Or... I'm exhausted.
There's been quite an intense focus on Neil Druckmann and the other creators of the game, essentially as the perpetrators of the crime of The Last of Us 2. It's quite an interesting demonstration of this kind of layman's media criticism we see quite often online, and essentially auteur theory on steroids mode of critique that credits anything good to a hyper-genius savant creator, but much, much more often blames anything bad, especially anything bad and woke, on a sinister cabal of SJWs who are ruining the games industry or the television industry or cinema with their sinister agenda that puts ideology above good art.
Nobody cares about your woke shitty game, you fucking extremist piece of shit. You fucking destroyed so many people's expectations and experience.
Trans representation and bullshit.
Ha! Yeah, now you done fucked up, you twat. You cuck. You enjoy leading the gay orgy, don't you, cheap Jew? Neil Cuckman. Damn, bruh.
You can be mad about the fact that Liv is useless, and that I think he has no purpose until out to, other than being Abby's sidekick trans friend. Go ahead and say, transphobic.
Let's forgive a murderer and an overall terrible person after he killed my dad. Forgive ISIS too. They are normal people and nice to their own family.
Ignorant snowflakes like you don't take it seriously enough. But hey, keep on being a mindless simp for Neil Cuckman.
Neil Cuckman.
Neil Cuckman.
Neil Cuckman.
Neil Cuckman, I hope you get the coronavirus.
Neil Druckmann, the creative director behind the game, has been the particular butt of many jokes and the target of many angry gamer rants, with accusations of him using the game to not only push his woke agenda but also polish his own ego. Druckmann, according to Twitter and 4chan, wrote the character of Owen as a self-insert, literally modelled off his body so he could have a nude sex scene with Abby.
Neil Druckmann, more like Neil fuck.
The justification for this particular rumour seems to be totally circular. We know Neil wrote in a self-insert character because that character has sex. At the same time, the thing that he did wrong was writing in a self-insert character just to give him a nude sex scene. And, you know, we know it's a self-insert character, you see, because he gave the character a... Now, if we're going to talk about Neil Druckmann as a representative of the management of Naughty Dog, there is a pretty fair and legitimate thing to discuss here, namely worker exploitation, because it's actually pretty well known that Naughty Dog, like many AAA game studios, engage in shitty worker practices, like crunch, making their employees work overtime, sometimes late into the night every day of the week, just so the game can be delivered on time without having to spend money on additional staff. But no, that's not the narrative being used to attack Neil Druckmann and Naughty Dog. Instead, it's that Druckmann wrote the game deliberately to champion LGBT people and people of color and to attack Christian conservatives and to blah 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 blah.
My white hot take here is, if Neil Druckmann did direct the game to be a purposeful attack on conservatism, which it's not inarguable parts of the game are that would be a good thing? Conservatism, let's just be real here for a second, fucking sucks. Contrary to what you may have heard online, it is not the new punk rock. But let's be even realer here, that is not what the game is about. The creators of The Last of Us 2 did not put in thousands of hours of work to create a game as complex with as much to it as this game has, just to dunk on chuds. Who are they? Me?
Discourse 4. Are there any good subtitle jokes to make about the fourth film in a franchise? I kind of want to go back to Star Wars and do a New Hope thing here, but it'd probably be weird if I've done different franchises for all three and then I just go back to Star Wars, right? Okay, I looked it up, and apparently the codename they've been developing the Matrix 4 under is Project Ice Cream, so... there is something pretty clearly funky going on here. How did all this discourse get so full of, well, lies? Now that the game's been out a little while, a lot of the popular critique has shifted to praise. That is to say, I think a huge number of the people who've actually played the game feel more or less how I feel about it. I think there were several instigating factors here that created a kind of perfect storm, right? First, the game is full of minority representation. Gay people, people of color, trans characters. Even for Abby's part, a powerful, muscular woman in this type of game is a fairly rare thing. Second, the shocking death of the protagonist from the first game. This was always going to be incendiary for some people. But thirdly, of course, the plot leaks. The first two factors didn't have to be as much of a problem for the discourse if they were only transmitted through people playing and enjoying the game. These things probably wouldn't have caused nearly as much of an upset. As soon as people were mad online, it was actually too late to engage with the game and what the game is about. Especially with only the leaks to go on and not the actual game, nobody gets to argue the game is actually about anything. Obviously, Joel was only killed for shock value. These SJW hacks are so desperate to subvert expectation, they'll do anything just to shock you. Meanwhile, in reality, honestly, even the leaked plot was enough to tell what the game was about. It's about revenge. It features 4 whole revenge quests.
You wouldn't believe how much revenge.
But the online narrative demanded, as it is wont to do, that every reaction should only be the angriest, most extreme, most binary good or bad take possible.
Just to get really Black Mirror on you for a second, this is the problem with how social media encourages us to approach art.
Everyone has to have a take, whether they've played the game or not, whether they've played the first game or not, whether they even remotely care about this game or the previous or the studio or games in general or not. Everyone has to have a take as soon as they possibly can.
The studio can't run late because the game was promised for a deadline, and the hot take industrial complex will suffer without content shot directly into the content hole on time.
So the workers have to be forced to work late, to never leave the office, never see their families. The plot's been leaked, so everyone must discuss it. Nobody can not have a take about the plot, even though nobody has played the fucking game yet.
Simply saying you'll wait for the actual game to come out is boring, so it doesn't get clicks, so it doesn't get shares, so it doesn't become the popular opinion everyone is talking about.
The game is out, so now everyone who has a copy must play it live to give their opinions and reactions live,
knowing full well that finding the game to be fine or excellent or just not as bad as everyone said won't get shared, and so it won't get to be the hot opinion everyone is talking about.
Something about our mode of consuming and discussing art is fundamentally broken here, and it has to do with the drive for both financial and social profit. All these people making all these videos condemning a game they haven't fucking played. This guy cutting up his disc and his Last of Us Part 1 disc too, because Joel died. You can't even really experience Joel's death until you play the rest of the game, because there are so many flashbacks and extra details, but this guy is so pressured to have a reaction that indicates that this is offensive, terrible storytelling that he cuts up his disc right away. This happens so early in the game! He hasn't He hasn't played the game! I am tired of these gamers, of Twitter, of being caught in the tangle of their bullshit. I just want to play video games. The Last of Us Part 2 is about moving on from what we had before. On one level, it's about grief, how we cope with the pain of losing someone. On another level, it's about what we choose to keep and what we choose to leave behind. The Last of Us concerns itself primarily with one popular facet of post-apocalyptic media, namely, what is a societal luxury and what is basic human nature? Or, in other words, what is optional and what is necessary? It's typical in many post-apocalyptic stories to make this distinction using the old world before the apocalypse contrasted against the present. The things people have now in the survivalist wasteland tend to be necessary basic human needs. The things people used to have in the old world but don't have anymore are generally considered optional. This is really interesting when applied to queerness. There is a homophobic and transphobic trope that tells us that queerness is a luxury, and your concern about queer characters in a story like this might be that it would paint queerness as optional. So how does The Last of Us 2 approach this? Well, in both the first game and the second, the post-apocalyptic world presents a subversion of the usual narrative device. It isn't modern liberal capitalism contrasted against zombie wasteland. The old world that contains the luxuries are actually brand new human settlements that are springing up. Boston in the first game, Jackson, Seattle, and Santa Barbara in the second. These settlements are all different, but they all use this same thematic device to tell us what is optional and what is necessary. In Jackson, an old man is homophobic towards Ellie and Dina. In Jackson, Dina is with Jesse, but she wants to be with Ellie. In Seattle, in the Seraphite world, Lev is forced to live an inauthentic gender and his community is policed by strict conservative norms and traditions.
But out in the wasteland, Ellie and Dina get to be together. Lev gets to live as his authentic self and still practice his religion, but without all the baloney. Queerness is necessary. Bigotry is optional. Spirituality is necessary. Conservative norms and traditions are optional.
To some degree, it just carries the message forward from the first game. A lot of people felt that Joel's arc in part 1 was basically going from only caring about himself to only caring about one other person. And yeah, that's true. Yes, that's true. But it's also the point. Seeing things from Joel's perspective, you understand it as a choice between losing humanity in a literal sense by not developing a cure, and developing the cure by sacrificing Ellie, and therefore losing humanity in a different way. If Joel's in-group contained everyone in the world, maybe he would make a different decision, but his us is just him and Ellie, and he'll always choose her first, and that's how everyone acts. It's not necessarily wrong, it's just human, but it keeps driving us toward cruelty and destruction. It's about the last of us. A perfect example from the first game would be David, the main antagonist from the Winter chapter. When Ellie first meets him, he asks to trade for the deer she shot because he's from a larger settlement that needs more food. His friends go back to get supplies to trade, and in the meantime, he and Ellie have to defend themselves from an infected attack. This simple situational change, making them need to survive together, makes David sympathetic. He becomes one of us for as long as they work together. Through the rest of the chapter, though, David's men hunt Ellie and capture her, and eventually he and Ellie have to fight to the death. Who's the in-group and who isn't is everything to the first game, and that's what informs the final decision, Joel's choice between saving all the people in the world and saving the only one who matters to him. This second game is extremely about revenge. Abby's dad was killed by Joel in the events of the first game, so she kills him and Ellie seeks her out to get revenge on her, killing a bunch of her friends along the way. Abby, meanwhile, meets Lev, a trans boy on the run from his transphobic community, and she saves him from them, but his quest to get revenge against them costs him his sister. Abby comes back, finds her friends dead, does some revenge on Ellie's friends, but Lev makes her let them go. Ultimately, Ellie chooses to go after Abby again rather than live a peaceful life, and her girlfriend Dina can't abide that. When Ellie gets back from finding Abby, even having decided ultimately not to kill her, Dina is gone.
See how much revenge is in that gosh darn plot? See how the revenge is never good? Revenge is never good.
I saw someone say that the game makes you do bad things and then tries to guilt you for them, and heck, I definitely feel that. On Ellie and Dina's ranch, knowing what's coming, holding JJ and looking out of the fields, or up in the night watching Dina and JJ sleep, I never want to leave. I want to make Ellie stay forever. I don't want to play another second of the game, but the thing is, the game isn't trying to shame you for anything. It's trying to show you how the characters feel about the decisions and actions they make, and I think it just does a fantastic job of that. I don't feel like I'm making any of the decisions in the game, but it breaks my heart all the same when Ellie leaves Dina and JJ on the farm. Going in, I was actually a little bit worried I was going to be smacked over the head by Abby's huge arms. And by Abby's huge arms, I mean the revenge themes. I was worried it was going to be quite over the top, because Abby revenging on Joel, Ellie revenging on Abby revenging on Ellie, and Lev revenging on his transphobic mum, it seemed like it was going to be about as subtle as a poke in the eye. But when I got around to playing it, it's legitimately powerful in the way it constructs different perspectives of the people you play as. I was shocked by how much Abby, this person I first met as a cold, angry, antagonistic character, came to be sympathetic and sad and sweet and caring. And ultimately, I think I like her more than Ellie. Although Lev is too good for this world and inarguably the best character. As an aside, after Abby hears Lev get misgendered...
Did you hear what they called me? Yeah. Do you want to ask me about it?
Do you want me to ask you about it?
No.
Okay.
Which I have to say is some S-tier cis allyship. Everyone, y'all should be taking notes. The fact you see Abby as this villain, this monster, when she kills Joel, before you know anything about her, before you know why, is for my money pretty fantastic. She's from another world. She grew up among the Fireflies, the resistance fighters from the first game, and when her father was killed and the Fireflies disbanded, she joined the WLF, Washington Liberation Front. Fundamentally, Abby comes from big projects, this world of collaboration and working to rebuild society. Her in-group is much bigger from the start. When her dad argues with Marlene during the events of the first game, he wants to sacrifice Ellie to find the cure to the disease, but Marlene puts it to him that he wouldn't do it if it were Abby. Just after she leaves, though, Abby, who is listening in, tells him that if it were her, she would want him to go ahead. This isn't meant to paint Abby as morally superior, but as with the first game, she's just part of an in-group, where Joel and Ellie are loners. Abby's group is much bigger. Even Ellie, having lived in Jackson for a few years, growing more used to a bigger community, is furious at Joel when she finds out what he did. In many ways, Abby is a reflection of Ellie and Joel. She reflects Ellie's quest for revenge, just a little further progressed, a few months further forward in time. And she and Lev are clearly a reflection of Joel and Ellie's dynamic from the first game. It's the simple but powerful storytelling trick the game does that teaches us about retributive justice and the desire to seek revenge. Like I said, when you first meet Abby, there's little reason to care about her, and then she kills Joel and becomes the absolute villain of the first act of the game. But starting over, at the crucial moment, and seeing things from her eyes really changes everything. That reflection of Joel and Ellie's relationship changes everything. It's fantastic.
As heavy-handed as The Last of Us 2 is with its messaging about revenge, the first time I played it I thought it was kind of funny. It doesn't really apply to real life. I don't generally go on quests to hurt the people who've hurt me. It should be obvious enough, right? You don't get anything by hurting the people who you feel have wronged you. Not even any kind of justice.
But then, my good friend Smart Boy Jack Saint pointed out that, if anything, the reception the game has received shows us that a lot of people do believe in retributive justice. They do think they can make things right if they hurt the people they think have hurt them. Sending death threats to Laura Bailey, accusing Neil Cuckman of being a sinister, plotting SJW. And it made me think of the end of the game, when Ellie has Abby overpowered and beaten, when she's choking the life out of her and holding her under the water. I was shaking a little watching this scene, watching these two characters I've been made to empathize with fight to the death brutally and horribly. And then, as the camera closes in on Ellie, she pictures Joel sitting on her porch with his guitar.
And it's not just that doing this won't bring Joel back. She knows that. What clicks into place for her in this moment is that this isn't what Joel would have wanted. Joel wouldn't have wanted any of this. None of this is what Joel would have wanted you to do.
Hey everyone, hope you enjoyed the video. I decided to be topical for once and cover a game that actually came out recently. I'd like to thank Baphometrics and Mel Stone for their excellent music, everyone who lent their voices to this video, all my patrons who make my work possible, and you, the viewer, for watching all the way to the end. If you'd like to see videos early and get access to excellent bonus content, you can head over to patreon.com/curiovids and give me $2, or more than $2. I had to push back my Witcher Mania by a month to focus on this one, so that'll be next month. And since we just hit $1,500 on Patreon, I'm going to finally start working on my big Zack Snyder video, which will be available a month early for $2 plus patrons when it's eventually ready. See you all soon for part 1 of my Witcher series. Bye for now.